Okay, well, welcome back everyone. So we're going to begin our second part here of our lymphatic discussion. So in the last part we left off kind of talking about the flow of lymphatic fluid. Now we'll begin to look at some of the various structures that are organ structures that are associated with our lymphatic system. So you can divide the lymphoid or lymphatic structures into two kind of categories based on what's happening to cells at these areas or at these structures. So the first one is called primary lymphatic structures or lymphoid structures. This is where cells are going to be formed, and this is where they're going to mature. All right. So meaning this is where these cells are developed. So remember our blood cells. We've got red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They were all formed in our red bone marrow, right? So remember, where's red bone marrow? Think of it at the ends of your long bones. So think like your epiphyses. Also, flat bones of the skull, vertebrae, sternum, your ilium, things like that, right? So red bone marrow is one, and then your thymus is another, right? And the cells that we're specifically talking about here are primarily our lymphocytes, right? Primarily our lymphocytes, which is a type of leukocyte, right? A type of white blood cell. So primary lymphatic structures, red bone marrow and thymus. This is where they go to be. This is where they're formed and they mature, and then they migrate to secondary lymphatic structures, and this is where they ultimately become activated. Right. So the immune response is initiated. The cells are activated, and they exert their particular effect in the immune system, as we will discuss later. Right. So we'll focus here on red bone marrow and thymus because these are our first two primary regions. Right. So first is red bone marrow. Right. So you talked about red bone marrow. You've talked about it previously. Whenever you do skeleton and whatnot. So this is contrasted with yellow bone marrow. Right. So you find this in the trabecula of spongy bones. Again, you can also find it in the epiphyses. You can find it in certain flat bones, things like that. In the red bone marrow, this is where you have hematopoiesis, right? So hematopoiesis is the development of our blood, right? So that prefix hemato or heme means blood, and then poiesis refers to like the production of, or the synthesis of, or the formation of, right? So this is forming blood, right? And again, the cells that we're specifically concerned with are the T cells and the B cells, or the T lymphocytes and the B lymphocytes, right? So for our bone marrow, I want you to think both of these cells, T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, T cells and B cells, they're both produced. I'm sorry, hopefully you can see my screen. I just realized that it was muted, so hopefully it is unmuted now. Hopefully you can see my screen. The T cells and B cells are both formed in the red bone marrow, and the B cells stay in the bone marrow to mature, right? So when you think of B in bone marrow, or when you think of B in B cell, think bone marrow, right? So this is where it's formed, and this is where it matures. Now, the B technically doesn't stand for bone marrow. It really stands for something called the bursa of Fabricius, and this is a region that was you can find it in chickens and other birds, but this is initially where the B cells were kind of isolated and discovered, so they reflect the name with the B. But for us, we can think of the B as standing for bone marrow, right? Red bone marrow. The T in T lymphocyte refers to thymus, right? So our T lymphocytes are going to mature in our thymus, and it is in the thymus where the T lymphocyte. So the T in T cell means thymus, right? So this is a structure, again, it's largest in children, so proportional to the heart. The thymus is the largest it's going to be during childhood, and then it progressively gets smaller and regresses and ultimately replaced with adipose tissue as we age, right? So if you ever do cadaver dissection, the several times when I've done cadaver dissection in the past, the the thymus, and again, typically with cadavers, they're typically older individuals, and so most of that thymic tissue has been lost, right? And it has been replaced with fat, been replaced with adipose tissue, right? So there's different regions to the thymus. There's an outer cortex and an inner medulla. Both of these contain various types of lymphocytes. So the outer region, the cortex, usually contains more immature T cells, and the medulla typically contains more mature T cells, right? Here you can see a kind of a visual representation of where you would find the thymus, and again, differences between a child here on the left and an adult on the right. So again, so here's your heart, relatively large, proportional to the heart in the child, and in the adult, relatively small, right? So again, proportional to the heart, it's much smaller in the adult, right? So here you can see some thymic tissue. Big thing again, notice, is the amount of functional thymic tissue between the child on the left and the adult on the right. On the left child, you can see the cortex, this kind of dark purple region. You can see this medulla, this lighter kind of pink purple region. Whereas in the adult, you see similar things, but much more of it is adipose tissue, right? Much more is fat. Okay, so consider these questions. We'll stop here with this kind of short part, and then we'll pick up and we'll begin talking about some of those secondary structures as well.